Hi, everyone. Welcome to Bringing Climate Journalism Above the Fold. My name is Adriana Licea. I'm the Managing Director at Green 2.0, where we work to increase diversity and equity within the environmental sector. I am really excited about today's event. So during today's conversation, we're going to talk about the current landscape of environmental journalism and how it really isn't reflective of the communities most impacted by the climate crisis. Particularly when we look at racial and ethnic demographics of reporters, we see a massive underrepresentation of communities of color. And this lack of diversity is glaring. And at our best, we can solve this problem when we have inclusive fields. We can really think about the ways in which if we had inclusive newsrooms, so many of these other issues would be fixed. And so I want to say, if we have spaces that retain staff of color, we retain staff in the profession, we decrease systemic bias within reporting, and we generate new approaches to the way that we include all voices in this conversation. So today's conversation is really going to focus in on the factors that newsrooms need to actually tackle head on in order to support current and future journalists and actually create a more reflective field. So thank you to my esteemed panelists today. Really, really thrilled again to be with you all. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves and just answer the question, what brought you to the field of environmental journalism, and how has your identity shaped how you inform this work? And Navina, we're going to start with you and just go across our panelist.
Sure, thank you. My name is Navina Sadasivam. I'm a senior staff writer at Grist, covering environmental issues, climate change, with sort of an emphasis on the oil and gas industry and the petrochemicals industry. This question about identity and how it shapes my work is a really difficult one to answer. I always struggle with this question. I was born in southern India. I grew up in the Middle East, moved to the US when I was 21, and I've been doing this work for a while now. Lived in Texas, lived all over the place, really, in my time here. And so I think, to the extent that I can sort of put my finger on it, I think sort of this diverse sort of background informs the way I approach the work. I tend to have a more global perspective, which I think is helpful when you're covering climate issues and you're covering the climate crisis, which is, as we know, a global problem. But beyond that, it's really hard to say how all these different identities kind of intersect and how that changes the way I approach my work. But that's what I'll say.
Hi everyone, I'm Manka Behl. I am an environment and climate change reporter in India, and I have been in this field for the last 10 years. I would say that my introduction to environment journalism was purely coincidental. I was once asked to cover a story on burning of municipal waste, and my job was to go there and report on why the waste was catching fire every summer season. When I went there and I spoke to the nearby slum dwellers, I just realized that the bigger story was the pollution story. How burning of plastic, how burning of e-waste was impacting the public health. And I just realized that environment as a beat has so much of scope, but despite that, it was not being covered in newsrooms. I think that is how I graduated into the beat, and I actually became the first environment and climate change reporter in my newsroom after that story.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us today. My name is Yesenia Funes. I am an independent journalist and also the editor-at-large at Atmos magazine. I love this question. I feel like my identity is inherent to the type of storytelling that I do. I'm a woman, I'm a Latina, I'm a queer person, I'm a child of immigrants, a child of the diaspora, and I really bring that into my reporting. I became a journalist because I grew up in the segregated suburbs of Long Island and witnessed extreme poverty in El Salvador, where my family's from, and just felt really compelled to do something about it. And journalism felt like the right path to be able to pursue action in this space through a creative outlet. And so for me, my journalism, though I cover environment and climate change, and I've been doing this for 10 years, the identities of the communities that I cover and my own identity is a part of the story every single time, whether that's looking at class, race, sexual orientation, gender, internationally, the sort of global perspective that Navina mentioned as well, where people are born, right? That's a crucial part of the storytelling work that I do. And I think that we need to have I think, more honest conversations in newsrooms about how our identities inform the stories we tell, because historically that hasn't been the way that I think we've been taught to do journalism.
Hi, I'm Justin Orland. I write about climate at Time. I came to climate by chance, really. I've been writing about climate for the past 10 years, just about. I was writing about other things. The opportunity to cover the climate beat came about, and I sort of jumped into it on a whim and was like, wow, this is really the most important story, and that was history. I think to sort of connect to the second question, I mean, when I, at the time, was writing, I was interested in maybe writing about politics, but also writing about race. I had studied, I was a history major, and I had studied the American Civil Rights Movement, and really was like trying to think about how I could write about that, how I could parlay that into, as a beat in journalism. And then I realized, like, oh, wait, I can write about that through climate. And I write about a bunch of other things too, but that was like one of the things that I found really compelling about the climate beat. And I guess broadly to say, like, identity is like wrapped up in everything, just to Yesenia's point, like everything that I write about in some way, I think it's part of how I approach like people and sources and like writing. It's not like necessarily at the front of every story, but it's like part of who I am, so therefore it's like part of how I do this job. So looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you all. It's so important to think about the ways in which our identity permeates everything that we do. So I think that was kind of a narrative throughout here as well. So let's get this conversation started. We can't really start this without talking about the state of journalism, right? Where are we right now? What's the media landscape? Tell us a little more about what's happening.
I can start, and maybe Justin wants to jump in after that. But the media landscape right now, I think it's fair to say, is just crumbling around us. I think that's the unfortunate truth, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. I was reading up a little bit ahead of this conversation, and the stat was something like 2.5 newspapers are closing every single week, apparently, or were closing every single week in 2023, and that's up from 2 newspapers in 2022. And so it just means that the industry, just newspapers are crumbling all around us. And that has a particular impact on climate coverage. Often what happens is when there are layoffs, because those are also happening, even if newspapers aren't shutting down, they're laying off a lot of people, and environmental coverage tends to be the first to go. Politics is, for instance, seen as very essential, but environment and climate is sort of often an afterthought, less so these days. I think that has shifted, but it still is a beat that's kind of underappreciated in a newsroom, and so I think that's kind of the state of play as I see it. Justin, what do you think?
Just the one thing that I would add, I think, oftentimes in these discussions, people are like, oh, like that's really sad. It's sad to watch journalism die. I think, it's true, the business model is broken, but there's also a role that like we all have to play in that. Like my next question will be like, oh, so do you subscribe to any publications? Like, oh, no, I just get it for free, like this way or that way. It's like, okay, well, maybe you should subscribe, and sometimes, particularly at a place like this, it's like, oh, you're working philanthropy. Have you thought about how journalism might intersect with the work that you support? And then it's often like, well, no, it's kind of hard. I don't know what the KPIs are, so I'm not really going to engage. And I get that perspective, but I guess I would encourage people to not just look at how sad it is that the industry is suffering, but also to think about what you might be able to do to help support it, because it is helpful for democracy. It's crucial for democracy.
Yeah, I'm the fourth pillar, right? And I also think that, like, despite the fact of how tragic I think the media industry feels, there are like little semblances of hope, right? I think Atmos is a really great example of what the future of climate journalism can look like. These sort of niche, independent publications springing up, finding, sort of off the path funding methods to exist, and trying to forge like new ways of storytelling. For those who aren't familiar, Atmos is a very like visually led, creative, artistic climate magazine that tells stories from frontline communities, often by frontline community members. And I do think that finding new ways to tell climate stories, and obviously like, new funding methods, is crucial to sustaining the climate story in this changing media landscape.
I think I agree with you there. Until a few years ago, climate reporting or environment reporting was unheard of in so many newsrooms. I remember when I would report on illegal tree felling or water pollution, my own colleagues would mock me and tell me, there's so much happening in the world out there. Why are you writing about a tree which is being felled illegally? And today, these same colleagues are reporting on environment issues. So I think we've come a long way. Although I feel environment and climate news is still struggling to make front page news. But yes, editors have really, I think editors are becoming more conscious about the importance of this beat.
Yeah, so at a time when we would think newsrooms would be investing in climate journalism, they're not. And I guess my question to y'all is just, are there places that you feel are doing some of that investment well, or resources? It's okay if there's not.
I love Grist. I mean, Navina,
I was gonna say, is it okay to plug my own news organization?
I think Grist is doing a hell of a job when it
Maybe-
comes to climate and environmental coverage. I mean,
Yeah.
the best. And The Guardian, I think, is also doing really immense coverage. I think they've released some stats, actually, that, like, some of their environment news coverage receives, like, the most engagement, and they have, like, a new metric on their website for, like, stories that readers spend the most time on. And I think there's, like, new ways of trying to understand what success looks like for stories beyond just clicks. I think The Guardian's doing a really excellent job of challenging the old ways of measuring that, too.
Thank you. So reporters around the world have faced real-life repercussions for reporting on gender, race, climate change, and for any issue that is sort of considered political or controversial, or for their own personal opinions on those topics. And so, can you all tell me a little bit more about what this has been like and your experiences?
I feel independent journalists are the most threatened. Thankfully, I had the backing of my paper. But, I can just share an incident with you. A large part of my job was to write against coal-fired power plants and the pollution that they were causing, especially to the marginalized communities in India. And I remember I was doing an investigative series on how one of the India's largest power plant had fudged pollution data. And a very senior official from the power plant tried to contact me through a mutual contact. And this man very casually tells me, yeah, hi, so you have to work late night? I said, yeah. Ma'am, we know you go alone on your bike. And I was so scared for months that I had to ask my colleagues to accompany me. I can also share an example with you. My senior colleague who brought me into this field, he would write a lot against coal mines. And I remember he used to go for his morning walks and he would be constantly followed by an official of that coal mine. And so I feel this happens because there are lesser number of journalists writing on these issues, and I think the political bigwigs or the private players feel that it's easy to target them because the numbers are less. And I feel if more people start reporting on these issues, we'll be all in a safer place.
Yeah, I think it's hard to compare against, what journalists in India and the Philippines and like across the world are facing when they write about these issues. Here in the US, I think the thing that I think about when I'm publishing a story against that is maybe not favorable for a coal mine or some sort of polluting industry is like, are we going to get sued? And, obviously we have a legal team that ensures that we have the resources to back up the story. But beyond that, I will say the kinds of repercussions that I see journalists in the U.S. facing is really a threat to their First Amendment rights in their ability to speak up and voice their own opinions. And this kind of goes back to what Yesenia was saying about like the identities that we bring to our reporting and how there isn't a real acknowledgement of what it means to be a reporter today. And so especially I think we can't be in this moment right now and not talk about the crisis in Palestine and the journalists who have voiced their opinions on that particular issue and the repercussions that they've faced. People have lost jobs, people have been banned from writing about those issues, and so I think those are the kinds of instances that I see on this front.
Yeah, I also think that there is sort of like a crisis that many climate and environmental journalists face in terms of like online harassment. I know that the Dart Center, which does work on like the trauma the journalists face and has historically done a lot of work on war correspondents, has seen that climate and environmental journalists are also experiencing a bit of like mental health impacts and PTSD from both like the types of reporting that we do, whether that's like covering extreme weather impacts and speaking to survivors of disasters, but also from the hate that folks experience online. And so I think that's something that newsrooms haven't quite figured out how to grapple with. You know, like newsrooms don't have therapists in office the way that, like, I have friends who work in fashion, they have just like a therapist in the office for if they're having a bad day. And I'm like, that would be nice to have a therapist in office. But going back to Naveena's point, I also think it's important for us to think about the ways that newsrooms are silencing, I think, those of us who speak out about issues, thinking about like 2020 when the Black Lives Matter uprisings were happening and so many journalists, specifically Black journalists, were barred from covering the protests. And I think that's something that we don't talk about often enough about in the climate and environmental journalist space, you know, whether journalists can cover stories affecting their own communities or stories that they have a stake in. You know, for instance, one of the stories that I love covering the most are stories about climate migration. My parents, you know, immigrated to this country many decades ago. And luckily, I haven't experienced that sort of like prohibition of covering these stories. But there are some newsrooms out there that would think twice about putting someone, you know, covering a story that they have a personal connection to. Like, that's what we're taught in J school, is you can't write about stuff that you have a personal bias in, right? And I think that we're starting to challenge some of these like traditional journalistic teachings that don't allow us to tell the stories that move us the most.
Yesenia, you touched on this, and I want to ask a little bit more about this. Can you talk about sort of mental health and well-being and the ways in which it's really not being addressed in the sector?
Yeah, I mean, it's it's not being addressed, right? I'm an independent journalist. I don't have, you know, I write for many outlets, and I think that there's a struggle for those of us who don't have like colleagues, or like I don't have my weekly meetings or folks that I can just sort of touch base with regularly to talk about the awfulness of the news or the awfulness of the day. But luckily, you know, some of us here on stage have been really incremental in building the Uproot Project. And I think that there's now growing spaces, and for those who don't know, Uproot Project is a network by and for environmental journalists of color to make space and opportunities for young journalists, but also longtime journalists. And I do think that it's important to like build that community and try to figure out, how to get through the sort of happenings, because the work we do is hard work. You know, we're not just writing about like a new fashion show or like the latest episode on Netflix. Like, we're writing about real things that for many of us, like, we're feeling ourselves, whether that's here or I have family in El Salvador and, you know, worrying about like droughts and severe rainfalls, right? And for those of us keeping up with the news, there's like death and devastation every single day related to climate change that a lot of other people don't need to confront as part of their everyday work. But we need more. You know, we need we need attention on this issue.
I think when we are out on the field, it's really easy to get overwhelmed by the sufferings of people that, you know, you're around. I was once interviewing a family. Their son died after drowning in a fly ash pond near a coal fire plant. And I remember it affected me so badly that I would keep talking about it in my therapy sessions. And that's when I realized the lack of resources in our newsrooms when it comes to ensuring the mental well-being of journalists. And I really hope that newsrooms and media houses facilitate something, some professional help for journalists, because apart from the work stress that is there, deadlines and giving exclusives, what you experience in the field really affects your mental health.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I think one of the things that's missing here is that folks don't always realize that you're humans, right? You are people. You are impacted by the things going on around you, even though you are also professionals. And so I'm really thankful that you're all talking about this and bringing this up during this conversation. So personally grateful. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about sort of diversity and equity within the field and what we're seeing. So we know that viewing the media through one lens, right, or one perspective is really going to limit the reality of the issues presented. And so I want to ask y'all, how does the lack of diversity in newsrooms really impact the coverage of climate change?
I can start. I think I might broaden it just from climate change to coverage more broadly. I mean, a lot of conversation in a newsroom will happen, in meetings with editors, conversations between colleagues, and I mean, it's almost like anything. It's like diverse perspectives will help broaden the conversation. It'll help root out things that shouldn't be, part of the conversation. And that's the same with coverage. And so if you have a team, broadly speaking, that isn't diverse, you're gonna miss things. And if you have an environmental team that is all white, you're also gonna miss a big part of the story. I guess, yeah, that's the sort of obvious point, I guess, but that's where I'd start.
I think newspapers and editors also look at what sells. So the onus is also on the readers to really, receive the climate stories well. There's a reason why beats like crime and politics make front page news, as I said earlier, because people are interested in that. So the onus is on the readers too.
I would just add that I think, climate coverage more specifically has changed quite a bit in the last decade, right? I remember a time when climate deniers were prominently featured in articles, and we've moved so far past that. And now we're in a moment where environmental justice is sort of top of mind for a lot of climate reporters, editors. It is very much part of the mainstream conversation, especially since the election of President Biden. And one thing that I've specifically noticed is that the coverage of EJ issues tends to be superficial. It isn't given the same sort of like rigorous attention that you might see another climate story being given. And I think part of that is because of a lack of diversity in newsrooms. It's that first order of reporting where people are saying, oh, this is an EJ issue, we must cover it. And it's, whether that's a White House policy or whether that's a community that's struggling, there's still, I think, more to be done on EJ coverage, and I think that's really a result of like a lack of diversity in newsrooms.
Can I just pick up on this point? It's a little afield from the question, but to Manka's point about what sells, I think the other thing here is what sells to whom, right? Because there's a perception, oh, well, this thing that's interesting to me, because I'm with my own particular set of life experiences, is what's going to sell broadly on the internet, which can be accessed by pretty much anyone. And actually, like stories about communities of color, stories that are broader than like the sort of narrow perspective that an editor might have, actually might sell. But you just have to, there has to be someone to champion it and get it across the line. Not that that's always easy, but that's an important role for diverse journalists to play in a newsroom.
There also needs to be like attention on audience development, right? Like among these communities, like there's so many Black and brown readers, non-English speaking readers, and how are we getting the climate news to those folks? I think that's like a really important part of the equation here too.
Yeah, Navina, I wanted to sort of follow up on what you said around environmental justice. I think often when we do see those stories, they're sort of seen as like they're an add-on, they're a nice thing, they're not really a need to have, or they're less serious than these other topics. And so thank you for sharing that, because I think it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately. I wanted to talk a little bit more about sort of once you're in the field as an environmental journalist of color, what factors sort of keep you there or, make you leave the field because it's not really sustainable for you anymore?
As someone who's recently left a full-time position to pursue my own ambitions, I think that newsroom leaders need to consider the needs of their team, right? Like it's of course every organization has its own goals, but how can your goals align with the goals of your staff members, right? Many of us, I think, who walk away from journalism, or who have walked away from journalism, or who have walked away from like staff jobs, I think would love a world where we can have our healthcare paid for, or get to tell stories that matter, right? But we need to have the support to do those stories. And so I think making space to listen to your staff, so that they can keep doing the work that they want to do, and not just like making space to listen to them, but actually making a plan to affect some change, I think is really, really key. Because I think in most newsrooms, team members express their needs, but there's not often a response, right, that actually can meet them. And I don't think it should be so hard if you want to retain folks to try to figure out how to retain them. Maybe it's a salary increase, right? Maybe it's a job position shift. Maybe it's not forcing folks to work like 12-hour days or weekends and nights, which is really common in newsrooms. But having like a realistic set of expectations for journalists so that we can keep doing this work without burning ourselves out.
Yeah, it's much easier to listen than to actually do something about it. So I'm glad that you brought up that point of action of like, yes, it's great to hear and grab the feedback and know that, but until you're actually making those tangible changes in your staff lives, it doesn't really matter. So thanks for sharing that. Justin, I've got a question for you. Wanted to, talk about the way that, leadership has to really embed diversity, equity, inclusion within newsrooms. And wanted to talk about a little bit more about, what kind of qualitative, quantitative data do we currently have about the state of diversity within the environmental sector, and the journalism sector?
We don't. We don't have much of a good sense. I mean, I think this is a big challenge, and to my sort of glib point about KPIs earlier, like it's hard to really know, what the problem is without being able to measure it. And this is a thing. Yesenia mentioned the Uproot project, which she served as the founding board chair of, and was, led us from our beginning. But I'm now on the board along with Navina of the Uproot project, and one of the initiatives we're working on, just to connect everybody almost on the panel with Green 2.0, is to try to actually measure some of this problem, to get the qualitative and quantitative data to really understand what's happening in the field with environmental journalists of color. And so stay tuned. We're working on that, and I hope that we'll have something by the fall.
Yeah, we're really hopeful we'll have something to you by September. So really excited about that. Yesenia, you talked about this a little bit earlier. You talked about sort of community and building that, and wanted to ask the panel just how do journalists really, and not just journalists of color, but how do they thoughtfully engage in culturally relevant ways with the communities they're working with?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm really attracted to stories that I think reflect like the community I grew up in, whether that's Spanish-speaking communities or immigrant communities. There's a story I worked on in 2022 about the ways that climate change is affecting the southwestern U.S., the desert there, and how it's making the migration journey for folks coming from Latin America and elsewhere more dangerous. And being able to like be out in the fields with this search and rescue group that goes and looks for migrants, I think it was really easy for me, I think, to spend time with some of these folks because, one, I spoke Spanish, but two, my mom immigrated across that desert, many decades ago, and being able to speak to Adriana Carrillo, she's the woman who runs that group, about, my mom did this journey and you do this work all the time. I think being able to like bring in my own personal connections to that allows for more vulnerability, more trust, more openness. And to this day, I check in on her and just see how things are going. Like it's more than just one-off like trip for a story, right? It's a relationship now, and I think that when you bring in your own culture into the stories you're telling and into the reporting you're doing, it just really helps sources trust you, which is really inherent to good storytelling, is having that trust so that they can tell you the parts of the story that will make your story that much better.
I think when engaging with communities, a challenge that I face is should journalists also become a part of that activism? Are we becoming journalists and also turning into crusaders? So I think sometimes we get so involved in storytelling that we are kind of bordering on activism, and some say it's a good thing, some say it's a bad thing. Different people are going to view it differently. But I feel the challenge is to kind of support the campaigns, but also ensure that a balanced report with a very pragmatic sense comes out.
I think for me, when I'm working on a story where, I'm engaging with a community that historically isn't used to maybe engaging with reporters or journalists, so much of it is also just the pace at which I work, which is to just slow down, just to slow all the way down and take the time to get to know people and build that trust, as Yesenia was saying, to get to know them, to kind of explain the journalistic process, because not everyone is aware what like on the record means or off the record means or on background means. And so just going through all of those paces very slowly, and then also at the end of the process to kind of check back in with them, share the story with them, share the reporting with them, share any impact that might have come up, and to not drop that story completely, to kind of maintain those relationships so that you can continue to like keep reporting on that community. And I think that's a big part of like building trust with a community.
Yeah, who would have thought that building authentic relationships, right? It's really building towards those things that are so important. So, we're living in an age of misinformation about climate change. We all know that. And so many of those issues impact communities of color. And so we'd love to know sort of how do we engage people of all generations to really be leaders in amplifying news and media that is actually accurate and reflective of the realities of our society?
I don't mind jumping in. I've been doing a lot of work with Yale Climate Communications. They do Spanish translations for some of their stories, in part because, at least among Spanish-speaking U.S. communities, there is like a massive misinformation crisis where like folks share crazy stuff from Facebook and WhatsApp messages, and it's really wild. Like a hurricane will happen, and instead of talking about climate change, they make it some kind of like religious God happened thing. It's which is fine. Religion is fine, but it's important to understand the science right behind these events. And so I think that we need to see more efforts like that, right? Like to reach communities where this misinformation is happening, get creative in how we reach communities. Atmos, for instance, has a really robust social media page on Instagram where a lot of misinformation happens as well, right? People post memes and share posts without any like sourcing and fact-checking information. I think that newsrooms need to become more sophisticated in how they reach audiences and engaging with the different platforms that folks are using and where misinformation is thriving, whether that's Instagram, TikTok, even WhatsApp. Yeah, I think we just need to get more creative about it because that's where folks are getting their news. They're not going to like CNN.com to get their news. They're just scrolling, and whatever appears in their feed is what they're consuming and believing.
Yeah, we need to meet people where they're at, right? And find the places where they're getting their news from and sort of attack those points of contact. I think this is like directly related to the news desert issue, right? Like you're having local newsrooms collapse, and so into that void you get Facebook and memes and this kind of misinformation spreading through those channels. And so to me, I feel like so much of it is propping up local news again and finding ways to support local news so as to ensure that and often local reporters are the ones that people trust the most. There's an established relationship there. Your local meteorologist, for instance, is a trusted source of news. And so how do we find ways to distribute that news through channels that are already trusted and like ensure that those relationships are maintained and like it doesn't all crumble in the way that it has been these last few years?
I think that, like, just to jump off of what Navina said, like, Grist is doing some really fascinating work around, like, partnerships and, like, redistribution, like, sharing national stories with, like, local papers and local audiences. And I think that newsrooms need to be more collaborative instead of, like, being so competitive, which historically has been the way of the news, finding ways to work together because the climate crisis is going to require a unity of sorts. This is not the issue, I think, to, like, be competitive about. So I just wanted to I guess.
Yeah, thank you for plugging Grist again. But yes, we have an incredible partnerships manager who is going out and finding ways to get the stories to the people who it is about and who it is for, and ensuring that these stories are ending up in local papers, in various outlets. So that's been a big part of the work that Grist has been doing in an attempt to kind of address some of these challenges.
Yesenia, what you said, I think happens even wider in the climate movement as well. So I did want to note that, like, this approach of collaboration is so important. So it's great to see Grist and other places actually starting to look at it this way instead of looking at it as competition against each other. Equitable opportunities to enter the sector is really, really crucial. And so want to know, are there programs, fellowships, other pathways that environmental journalists of color could take if they want to enter the field?
Well, Grist has an amazing fellowship program that we just wrapped up hiring for this year. But applications will be open again later in the year, and this is a year-long fellowship that's fully paid, and we're a union shop. So as fellows, you're also a member of the Grist Union. And then I'll plug Uproot again. We have grants on offer for freelancers who are working on projects. We have a Slack group where there's open conversation about various environmental issues, and you can find other climate reporters there and find support systems, networks through Uproot. Yeah, that's what I'll say.
I think that in a developing country like India and also in other developing countries, there are some training programs, there are some fellowships, but very limited. And when journalists in these countries, when they try to apply for international fellowships, the competition is so tough that it's really hard to get in. Even if a journalist like me wants to go to COP and cover the event, it's something which is unimaginable because we can't afford that, and the fellowships are quite few when it comes to the number of journalists who are actually interested in going for them. And I also feel that apart from reporters, there should be more programs for sensitizing editors and desk people, because sometimes the one who is making the page or the one who is editing your story doesn't realize the importance of that news, and then that's how climate stories get cut and cropped. So that is one thing which is really missing.
Yeah, there's a fellowship with the Solutions Journalism Network as well that is really great. They provide training on how to do solutions journalism, and the Society of Environmental Journalists has a lot of grants opportunities. I think someone mentioned to me yesterday the Pulitzer Center has some really amazing opportunities, though of course that's more grant-based and not necessarily for training. And I think the Metcalf Institute has some training available for early career journalists as well.
Yeah, is there something philanthropy could be doing here? Curious as y'all said that.
Sorry, this is where I was thinking that, because this is my little pet talking point, because I think it is relevant, right? Especially to Manka's point, there, if we want to address climate change, just really broadly, take journalism out of it, people need to understand what's happening or have some sense of how it affects them, and journalists are. That's what our job is. And so you think about a global energy transition, you would want people in India, which is crucial to the global energy picture, to understand what's happening. And so I keep going back to that. The more that philanthropists can think about ways to facilitate this, and granted, there are lots of challenges to support organizations in India right now, but. From outside, but just what are the mechanisms that can help make that happen? This would be a huge climate solution. So anyway, that's my little pet talking point.
It's an important one. There was just a news a couple months ago that CUNY Newmark, the Graduate School of Journalism in New York, they received a major donation from. The Craigslist guy, what's his name? Craig Newmark. He gave a giant donation to make tuition free by 2027. And so I think that investing in J schools, investing in newsrooms, investing in trainings, but also we were talking about this earlier, investing directly in journalists, independent journalists who are doing the work, would do massive work for the industry. It would really be a big benefit for the storytellers doing this work.
And for philanthropists, there are models of success, right? You look at a place like ProPublica, for instance, or even Grist, that's funded largely through philanthropy. And these are models that have been working and have been doing well for the last decade or so.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We're now going to take a couple of questions from the audience. So wanted to open it up to Q&A. I think we're walking around. Great.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for a great panel. This is sort of a broad question, but I would love to hear from each of you or from one of you just a little bit about how you find stories and how you deem something is worth time covering as a journalist, and how you find these new stories and decide what to devote your time to.
I feel initially it's a little difficult for all of us to find stories, especially when it comes to environment and climate change, because the number of people that are actually working in this field, be it activists or experts, is quite limited. But slowly and slowly we develop our network. We go out on the field, we meet people, we contact scientists, we get in the group of activists, and I think we develop our own circle of sources who, and then when you are consistently reporting on these issues, these are the people who come to you with stories. You know, there comes a time when you don't always have to go and find stories. If you are consistent with your work, stories will come to you.
I would just kind of just add very briefly, if you're looking to, like, you know, you're working on something that you think should deserve some coverage, like, build a relationship with, you know, a journalist. Like, you know, first identify somebody who's interested in what you do. Like, don't just email a random person who is kind of tangential to what you do, but like figure out who might actually be interested. Like, try to get coffee with them. Try to like build the relationship that Mank is talking about.
Hi, I'm a youth climate and environmental justice activist, and I also work with young people getting their voices in earned media. And a lot of activists and campaigns rely on earned media coverage, but with the changing landscape of a lot of newsrooms and these climate beats closing, what advice could you give to specifically young people who aren't exactly journalists, but I do a lot of op-ed writing, to continue getting my stories out there and my voice out there when I'm losing a lot of contacts with reporters and journalists?
I think that if you're talking about like doing your own writing as well, I think it's really important to self-publish. I think that being able to share what you've published on your own with editors, with other journalists, can really help your efforts. I also think that getting clear on like what the narrative is that you want to share. Like, you know, sometimes I do interviews with folks, and you know, I have to really like dig it out of them. Like, what is like the sort of like narrative arc of the campaign you're working on, or of your story? And there are some folks that I've interviewed that just like really know how to, I guess, sell themselves in a way that's compelling and unique and extraordinary. And so I think trying to figure out what that narrative looks like for you, and making sure that you're getting the words out there, regardless of whether someone's gonna, you know, assign you an op-ed or like approve an op-ed submission. Just publishing it on your own, whether that's like on Medium or like there's now newsletters, right, like Substack and Ghost. Being able to self-publish, I think, is really empowering. And sharing that with other editors to give them a sense of like, this is what I want to talk about, this is my issue, would love to find ways to work with you in the future. But yeah, I hear you, there's a lot of fascinating and incredible work happening, and there's not enough of us to cover it all.
I'll say very briefly, I think that there's more demand for op-eds now, particularly in a lot of newsrooms where you know, they don't have the staff, so they want to continue to cover the issue, and they might have, you know, maybe a slightly increased freelance budget or more demand for op-ed. So figuring out which places are really trying to you know, draw those in is probably helpful.
My name is Harvin. I'm a journalist. Could you all speak on the intersections of climate journalism and climate science research, and how improving the conditions that each face go hand in hand in improving like climate communication?
Justin? I mean, climate researchers are so essential to the work that we do, right? I rely on any number of climate scientists to talk to me and explain to me, you know, what the latest news is and what the science says and what we can and cannot say in stories. And so I think the extent to which climate scientists are able to foster relationships with reporters and be available to them to answer sometimes very silly questions in a way that like a layperson can understand. I think it's just absolutely crucial. So, yeah.
And I think they really give a good weightage to our stories. When we quote climate scientists, the story is kind of approved. What we are writing gets a validation.
Hi, my name is Sydney. I'm here on behalf of Aspen Latinos in Society. I guess I just thought it would be worth asking about the influence of AI in journalism and good, honest storytelling heading into an election season. So if you guys could comment on that, I think that'd be worthwhile.
Yeah, it's scary. I find the use of AI in journalism and in the media space quite frightening, honestly. And it is very much connected to the fact that we've seen so many newsrooms lay off people. I think there's a feeling among some executives that a lot of the work that we do can be done by AI, and so I worry about what that means for climate journalism and environmental journalism. There have been, to some extent, we already use AI, right? So I do want to acknowledge that. So like when I'm using a service like Otter or Trint to transcribe an interview, that is being powered by AI. And, ChatGPT, for instance, I have certainly used it to analyze data. So there are powerful uses of AI, I think, as reporters and journalists. I think we need to have more conversations about what that means if we're using AI to write stories or write headlines or social media content or whatever form of AI we choose to use. I think those need to be very, very carefully considered.
Yeah, I also worry just about the way that like our writing is being used to train these models, and what value that places on the work that we do. Yeah, it's definitely like a double-sided sort of coin there, though, because there are like newsrooms that are trying to utilize AI in really innovative ways. Again, going back to CUNY, the Craig Newmark Graduate School, like that's a big part of their training now is trying to like teach day school students tools on AI, so that they can be more vigorous reporters and like sort of make their work lives a little bit more simpler. But it's concerning. I used to work at Gizmodo, which is a part of like the media house, like Jezebel, Deadspin, and they laid off a ton of folks and are now using AI generated blogs, and there's like inaccuracies and they have to like take stories down regularly. And it's heartbreaking because, what we write about is complicated stuff like climate science. I don't know that I would trust an AI to like be able to dissect climate science and like write about disasters or a study. And yet it seems like a lot of newsrooms are sort of doubling down on that. I think BuzzFeed also laid off a ton of its staff with the hopes of like having AI generated stories. And so I think we need like regulations on this. It's just like there's a lot more that needs to be happening on AI. Before that keeps like stealing our work.
I would just say like as a news consumer, I would check to see what a publication's sort of statement on AI is. I think most sort of executives, like companies, top executives have been forced to say publicly in some context like we are doing this or not, and I probably wouldn't trust a place that's relying on AI. So that's not necessarily useful when it gets onto Twitter and onto whatever platforms where that's not being checked. But I do think like as a consumer that's how I would approach it.
I personally feel AI is quite useful when it comes to data analysis and data visualization, but to think that AI can replace journalists, I think that's quite unfair, because where are you going to get the human touch from? We go to the field, we go to ground, we interact with communities, and we bring out personal stories, and I don't think AI can do that.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah Street. I'm a media associate with NRDC. I'm sure at least a couple of you have seen me in your inbox. I just wanted to know how someone like me can support journalists like you in the best way, whether that's, sending you the preemptive outreach before things are happening, getting you embargoed press releases when we know stuff is happening. And also for journalists in the room, especially BIPOC journalists, I've been really trying to make sure we're reaching the right people. So please approach me and give me your contact information. I'll get you on our lists.
I think it's all the things that you said, is providing embargoed press releases, making sure that there's enough time before publication that you're not reaching out, a day before, but giving us, 4 or 5 days advance notice so we can make sure that we can cover the story well, and being available. I think it's all the things that you seem to be already doing.
And then also amplifying our stories if you can.
That's what I was gonna say. I'm like, yeah, like sharing our stories, I think goes a long way. But also, like, I think that one thing that many of us struggle in the climate and environmental space is like finding sources of color as well, and not getting like the same sort of cis white dudes in our inboxes that we should be interviewing. So I think that would be really helpful, is just being able to like having help identifying like who are the emerging like leaders at NRDC that I should be interviewing that maybe I haven't heard of yet. That's something that I personally try to do, and it's, you know, it takes time to try to find women, you know, non-binary folks, Black and brown folks, and so like if organizations were more intentional about uplifting and platforming those individuals, it would make my job a lot easier.
I also wanted to note that in September, Green 2.0 actually released an environmental experts of color database, and you can actually search a whole plethora of environmental experts of color. And I think it's a useful tool for reporters as they're looking into these things as well. We have another question.
Hi, my name is Cameron. My background is in environmental justice journalism. I've had the pleasure of reporting for Grist, Atmos, and with support from the Uproot Project, so it's a lot of fun hearing about all of your organizations. My question is around how journalists can go above and beyond in just, I know there's this sort of question of whether or not advocacy journalism is appropriate, but when we're talking about communities that say don't have access to the internet or just are having trouble accessing their own coverage, their own story. One example I think of in this sort of decline of journalism is the close of Southerly magazine and how their model was very much like, we're not just going to write this story, we're going to push against this idea of helicopter journalism, we're going to provide brochures for people that don't have internet. And I'm just curious how y'all see that playing into your work or the future of whether it's nonprofit journalism like at Grist or in more mainstream outlets. How can we go above and beyond in supporting folks who might just not have access to the reporting?
I can speak to this a little bit. I'm glad you brought up Southerly because Lindsay Gilpin, who founded Southerly, is now at Grist. And so she's continuing on her work and the approach that she sort of built around community engagement. One thing that I did or Grist did for one of the stories that we published last year about a petrochemical industry, a petrochemical plant in Port Arthur, is once the story published, we printed out mailers and sent it out to the 2 zip codes that were in and around that facility so that the people who that facility was sort of directly affecting had access to the story and to ensure that that story reached them. So that's sort of, one way in which it's a form of, it's a way of engaging with the community, the people that you're writing about, to ensure that the story ultimately is reaching the people that you've written about. So that's sort of one approach that I've seen, is ensuring that once a story is published, that you're finding ways to get to people that you've written about.
Thank you all for your time today. Just a quick question. I know you're all covering things within the environmental beat, but what do you see as your next story? Or what is the next trend or thing that should be covered within climate space?
I think the so-called clean energy transition is like the biggest story. Even yesterday on the main stage, we heard all this talk about clean hydrogen and renewables and clean energy. And I think that as journalists, we need to be really critical of what that looks like and what are the ramifications on frontline communities. What actually is clean hydrogen, and what do fossil fuel phase outs look like? Is that even a part of the question? I think that the clean energy transition is being celebrated in a really problematic way. And journalists, it's like our duty to unpack that for readers and really look critically at what that looks like and who's being affected by this so-called clean energy transition, whether that's like the mining of lithium in South America or even in like Utah or California, and what these facilities, what the air quality ramifications are of these facilities, whether that's in the Midwest or in the South. And yeah, taking like a hard investigative look at that, I think, is the big story right now that we as journalists need to pay attention to.
I would just add, in sort of the way that you've framed the question, it's like we're all thinking about the environmental stories, which of course we are. I think it's important to think about like what are the stories that are rooted in climate and environment, but also like touching our lives more broadly, because I think that's how readers often engage. And I think particularly now in this media environment, we see a lot of sort of more niche publications taking off. And I think that's because they're reaching people where they are. They're able to like actually access the things that they care about. And so I guess, it's not a specific story, but I think paying attention to where people are and what they want to read and accessing them that way is like an important future thing for us to think about.
Thank you. That was our last question. Definitely appreciate everyone in the audience who asked such wonderful questions. So, at the beginning of this panel, I asked you to talk about what the landscape of environmental journalism was. And so I'm curious from each of you, just some final words about what we can do to change that landscape.
If there are any philanthropists in the audience, fund us, give us money. That's the most sort of direct answer is find a place that's doing good work and help them keep doing that work and doing more of it.
I think also representation of journalists of color in more leadership roles would help. And sorry, I also feel that the international media and especially big media houses, they need to be more open and receptive towards stories that are coming from the journalists of colors.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna echo Navina. Like, I think it's investing in journalists, and to the point that Justin made earlier, like, pay for your news, subscribe to independent journalists. Like, many of us have newsletters. I have my own independent newsletter, and being able to like have, support those outlets and those individuals goes a long way to supporting the journalism that they do.
Yeah, just to build off that, I agree with both of those. And then I would say, read. That's like important for because like we also like have engagement metrics. We're trying to like draw in people to read. So read, pay to read, and if you can, like think about the bigger systemic questions and how you can help support more sustainable business models.
Thank you, Justin. If you take away anything, pay to read. I love it. Thanks, everyone.